Emmanuel didn't come back until 3 a.m., and when he didn't go straight to his room. He went to his daughter's room. Tayo had heard the sound coming from the door. She was a light sleeper. At first, she thought the men had come back, but they wouldn't have a key to her house. So, she crept slowly from her bed and saw her husband's figure going in the direction of their daughter's room. Maybe he wanted to tuck her in, but it was something he never did, so it was strange that he would want to do it now. She moved closer and saw him standing at the foot of her bed, and then came something that chilled her to the bone. He said, "I will be free once you are gone." She hid in a corner when she saw him leaving. What did it mean by that? Why would he say her daughter would make him feel free when she was gone? Again, Taya said a silent prayer. The next afternoon, the house was filled with an heavy silence. Nobody spoke, because each person had a lot on their mind. "I will be taking Hire to my friend's daughter's slumber party," Emmanuel spoke. Taya looked at him, and before she knew it, she did something she had never done before. She questioned her husband. "Why?" she said, with a frown on her face. Emmanuel was taken back by his wife's behavior. Did she know something? That wasn't possible. He had been careful with his movement. So he said, "I have been working a lot lately and haven't had time to spend with her, so I would love to make up for lost time." He smiled to his daughter. Something about his smile was chilling. Tayo hadn't told her husband about the visit of the men who came. She tried to convince herself that they had come to the wrong house, but they had called her husband's name. She couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right, but she didn't know where to start. Dear listeners, if you feel that something is wrong, then it definitely is. The next day, Tayo made up her mind to find out what was going on. And so, the moment her husband and daughter left home, she followed them. When her husband dropped off their daughter, he didn't head to work. Instead, he went into a seedy building. He stayed in the building for over 4 hours, only for him to be thrown out. She tried to get out of the taxi to help him, but that would just let him know she was on to him. Then she saw him go into his car, and then he went to work. When Taya got home, she didn't understand the events she had witnessed. The building her husband had gone into didn't have a signboard, so she didn't know what the building was. Her thoughts were interrupted by her phone ringing. It had been doing that all day, but she was too focused on solving the mystery of her husband's life. She picked up the call. "Hi there," the voice said. "Am I on with Mrs. Tayo?" "Yes, you are," Tayo said. "Who are you, and how did you get my number?" The voice on the line replied, "I have been trying to get in touch with you. My daughter goes to the same school as your daughter. I got your number from the principal. I hope that is okay." Sure," Tayo said, "but how can I help you?" The woman on the phone continued, "I was hoping I could hire you to make some pastries for my daughter's birthday/slumber party. You see, she wouldn't stop talking about how delicious your pastries were." "Oh," Tayo said, "I'm sorry, but I don't sell my pastries." "Please," the voice begged. "You know how children are when they want something, especially for their birthday." Tayo understood the woman's plight. She had a daughter of her own. So she agreed. They made some calculations, and Tayo agreed to the amount she would be paid. At the back of her mind, she kept telling herself that she wasn't working, but helping out a fellow mother make her child happy. When she got off the phone, she proceeded to read her messages, only to find people asking for the same services and offering to pay her for them. She felt like a fraud. These people thought she had talent, but she didn't. She simply loved making pastries, so she did what she thought was right and rejected them all. Mommy, Ire showed her mother a drawing. She was stumped when she saw the picture she had drawn. It was the men that had come to knock at their door the other night. She grabbed the book and asked her daughter where she met them. She simply said, "They are daddy's friends." Tayo's jaw dropped. Ire continued, "And daddy is going to take me to his friend's daughter's slumber party next month." When Ire said this, She covered her mouth. Oops. Mommy, don't tell Daddy I told you our secret. Taya ran into her room and called her mother. Her head was pounding. When her mother finally picked up, she told her all that had been happening. But her mother kicked off all her suspicions and told her never to doubt her own husband. She told her she was clearly overthinking and that the spirit of the devil was clouding her judgment. Taya couldn't believe what her mother was saying. How could she tell her that the things she heard and saw were some illusions? She knew she wasn't wrong. Her intuition was screaming that something was seriously wrong. She kept her eyes and ears peeled on her husband throughout the day. The day for the slumber party was fast approaching, and she was more nervous each day. But her husband didn't exhibit any odd behavior. When Taya went to deliver the client's pastries to her, she seemed lost and her mind was wandering. She didn't look at where she was going. She almost tripped when she tried to set down the pastries. Mrs. Adoni saw the distress in her and went to help her and asked if she was okay. Taya, unable to hold it in, burst out in tears and told her problems to this stranger. Strangely enough, she didn't look at her as if she was crazy. She leaned in and pat her back while she cried. When she was done, the woman before her said, "What is your next move?" Taya didn't know what she would do next or what was happening, but she had intuitions that something was wrong, and she simply wasn't going to ignore them. Mrs. Adoni said, "Why don't you bring your daughter here tomorrow for my daughter's birthday/slumber party, and in the meantime, you can confront your husband and make sure you record this conversation so you would have proof if something sinister was going on." Taya thanked her, 1, for believing her, 2, for helping her keep her daughter safe. When Emmanuel woke up, he expected to find breakfast and his family at the dining table. Instead, he saw his wife with a determined look and no sign of his daughter. "Why is Ire?" Emmanuel asked. "At a slumber party, away from you and those men," Tayo shouted. "What are you talking about?" Emmanuel asked, his voice trembling. Tayo stood up to him and looked at him squarely. "I know about those big men you have been taking my daughter to, and I also know about you going to that strange building." "Have you been spying on me?" Emmanuel retorted. "You as my wife should trust me, your husband, and never question me," Emmanuel roared. Taya almost caved at the familiar words of her doing her so-called duties as a wife, but she squared her shoulders. This was about her daughter and she was going to get to the bottom of this. She gave a strange smile. "You can try as much as you want to turn the conversation around, but I know what I saw and I will have no problem telling anyone, especially the church, about this." Emmanuel's eyes grew. He didn't want everyone to know his business. So he decided to change tactics. A little truth to calm her down and a little lie to reign over her. "Okay, fine," he began. "I owe those men money and they have been harassing me." That was how they knew about Ire. The first question Tayo asked was why he borrowed money from them. They were living well. "I got into gambling," he said, "but I swear I no longer gamble." Taya was flabbergasted. She didn't know the man before her, but at least the picture was coming into view. It explained the man's presence, the strange building he went into. But there was still one question on her mind. But why did her daughter say her dad was going to take her to one of the thug's daughter's slumber party? She was about to ask this very same question when her husband knelt before her and started crying and asking her for forgiveness. Dear listeners, this is a sign of someone who is trying to manipulate the other person by using their emotions. He made her promises of never gambling again. He even told her he had almost paid off his debt and those men would never disturb them ever again. To be honest, Tayo had more unanswered questions than answers. The next day, she called Mrs. Ajoni and even she had the same concern. She advised Tayo to go to the police with her recordings of her husband. This unnerved Tayo. After all, this was her family. She didn't want to break them apart if she could help it. Mrs. Adoni knew that Tayo felt anxious and told her she had a police friend who could help them check up on the man her husband owed money to, and also to help corroborate her husband's story without anyone knowing. Tayo felt relieved that her family would be saved until she knew what was going on. The pounding on the door made Emmanuel angry. He didn't understand who that was or what they wanted, so in his angry state, he opened the door without looking through the people. He was surprised when he saw policemen in front of his home. But what was more surprising was that they were asking him if he was Emmanuel Akere, and then they cuffed him. Tayo ran out of bed at the ruckus going on. She saw that her husband was being arrested. She was confused. All they told her was where their station was. She didn't bother putting on clothes, but she called Mrs. Aduni, who came as soon as she could. She promised to take Ire with her to her home while she sorted out her husband's issues. Taya was escorted to the Inspector General's office. The officer in charge told her that her husband was a suspect in their ongoing case of trafficking. Taya didn't understand. Her husband was a bank manager, not a criminal. She told the inspector this as well. The inspector then showed her proof that her husband was fired from his position 2 months ago on charges of embezzling funds. And he didn't stop there. The private investigator that was hired by the bank found out that he had embezzled funds to fuel his gambling addiction. Taya's jaw dropped. But that was the tip of the iceberg. Her soul was about to leave her body. As the private investigator dug deeper, he found something more sinister going on. The inspector said, "He found out that the gambling den your husband visited was also a front for trafficking. When he reported to us, initially we didn't think your husband had anything to do with the miscreant except for his debt. But it seemed he had made a deal with them to cancel his debt in exchange for handling over his daughter." "No, no," Tayo said, interrupting the inspector. "No, no, no," she kept repeating. "He is lying. How can you trust the words of a criminal?" The inspector understood how the woman in front of him felt, but he needed to continue. So he handed her a glass of water and gave her some time to gather herself. When she was visibly calm, he continued, "Mrs. Akere, we have made a thorough investigation about this. We are not wrong." Tayo tiptoed to the cell her husband was held up in. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "Were you really going to sell our daughter to save yourself?" Emmanuel turned to his wife. Everything was out there, so there was no need for him to pretend. So he said, "What good is a girl child? She would only become a decoration in the home of her husband at the end of the day. That is how our society works. So I thought she could at least be a good use to me." Tayo stood, listening to the vile things her husband was saying. She didn't know when she stepped forward to the bars of the cell and gave him a deafening slap. She turned around and never looked back. 2 years later, Tayo was in a pastry shop, baking with her daughter, reading at one of the tables. After learning about the vile things her husband had done, she called her parents. Of course, they blamed her for not being a good wife and standing by him. They even made excuses for him, saying the police were lying or that it was the devil's work. And it wasn't much different with the church either, so she knew that she couldn't go back to those people. Those were not people that would stand up for her. She sold her jewelries, moved out of the house they were living in because her husband, well, ex-husband, had taken out a loan from the bank without telling her. So she set up her shop with the money she got from her jewelry and rented a small apartment for her and her daughter. It was a learning curve for her, but she gritted her teeth and sailed through. She shook the memories away from her head and got to preparing for the opening of the shop. It was always busy and she was grateful for it. The end. Have you ever had people in your life call you crazy for something you knew you were right about? Have you ever been manipulated by someone that you loved? Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and of course, share.